Recently, I've noticed a strange trend that occurs when copyrighted characters enter the Wild West of the public domain. Suddenly, low-budget studios seize the opportunity to reimagine our favorite childhood characters into cheap, distorted nightmares in horror movies that no one asked for. Characters like Steamboat Willie, Bambi, and Peter Pan have already been subjected to these occurrences. If that's not scary enough, there's also rumors of possible reinterpretations of the Teletubbies, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Powerpuff Girls, and even the purple dinosaur himself, Barney. However, for today, I'll be reviewing an independent horror slasher film based on everyone's favorite honey-loving bear, Winnie the Pooh. That fell into the hands of a silly old independent studio, leading to this movie being nominated as the worst picture of 2023. So, without further ado, let's start yapping about the low-budget horror slasher Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. So, the movie begins with drawings that illustrate the backstory of Winnie the Pooh and his friends, and how they transformed into a group of raging serial killers. Years ago, a child named Christopher Robin stumbled upon these weird-looking animal creatures named Owl, Rabbit, Eeyore, Piglet, and of course, Winnie the Pooh himself, in a forest known as the 100-Acre Wood. Despite their odd appearances, Christopher didn't mind and chose to spend time with them. Over the years, he is depicted sharing food and playing with them for hours on end. But, as Christopher grew older, he realized that hanging out with a bunch of strange-looking animal creatures wasn't really his thing anymore. So, he decided to ditch them to attend college, leaving Winnie and the others to fend for themselves. With the arrival of winter and without Christopher to DoorDash them food every day, Winnie and his friends found themselves on the brink of starvation. Driven by desperation, they made a tough decision to resort to cannibalism, ganging up on Eeyore as their first unfortunate victim. This distressing turn of events only added fuel to Winnie and the others' resentments towards Christopher Robin for basically ghosting them. This led them to forget their soft and cuddly personalities and revert to their animalistic ways, which, for whatever reason, meant that they were actually going to go on a murderous rampage and essentially kill every human in sight. So, it seems we're off to a pretty interesting start with this disturbing backstory. However, it does raise the question, how did Winnie and the others manage to survive the harsh winters before they met Christopher Robin? Did they just randomly pop into existence before they met Christopher? Like an NPC spawning into a game? Or did they resort to similar drastic measures but with other companions we don't know about? Anyways, a few years later, Christopher Robin, now an adult, returns to the 100-Acre Woods with his fiancée, Mary. As they venture deeper into the woods, Christopher reveals his intentions for bringing her along. He hopes to introduce her to his childhood friends, Winnie and the others, to prove that his childhood stories weren't just figments of his imagination, hoping this will prevent her from thinking he's simply crazy. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she thought her potential future husband is kind of crazy for trying to find a group of animal creatures who were also his so-called childhood friends in the middle of the woods just to convince her that he's not crazy. Eventually, Mary attempts to gently confront Christopher with the possibility that Winnie and the others may not actually exist. However, a sudden noise disrupts their conversation, believing it to be Winnie. An excited Christopher races towards the sound, momentarily forgetting Mary and almost leaving her alone in the middle of the woods. However, when they arrive at the location from which the noise is coming, they discover what appears to be Christopher's childhood fort, now abandoned and desolated. As they continue their search, entering the now abandoned fort from Christopher's childhood, Mary grows increasingly anxious for their safety. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching prompts them to hide in the fort for their safety. What confuses me most about this scene is Christopher agreeing to hide without any prior knowledge of the danger Winnie and the others may pose, especially after describing them as being friendly and playful. But I guess you can't always be too careful when you're in an abandoned building in the middle of the woods. After a few hours of hiding, Christopher and Mary attempt to leave the fort. But then, out of nowhere, Piglet, the tiny, timid character we all know and love, appears with a chain, forcibly choking Mary. Christopher makes a poor attempt to stop Piglet and then just stands there while his soon-to-be wife chokes to death. I mean, we all knew how this was going to play out, especially when your soon-to-be husband has an obsession from his childhood with strange-looking animals he used to play with. In a startling turn of events, Christopher finds himself cornered by Winnie and Piglet, who have transformed into giant menacing figures. He then tries to beg for his life before the scene transitions to black. And I'm guessing due to this movie having a low budget, they just showed drawings to illustrate what happens next. The drawings illustrate Winnie and Piglet showing Christopher the skeletal remains of Eeyore as a dark reminder of the consequences for ghosting them. They also show a haunting image of a burning corpse, implying that Christopher's fiancée, Mary, has been burned by Winnie and Piglet. Well, it looks like they're not going to be having a honeymoon anytime soon. Get it? Because honeymoon and Winnie loves honey? Never mind. So, we can pretty much stop here, as this film completely derails into a terrible horror film that randomly transitions to a group of friends unrelated to Winnie the Pooh. Probably because the scriptwriters also got lost in the 100-acre woods. Usually, even the worst horror movies can be quite entertaining, especially when watched with others, as you can collectively roast the movie. This was my initial expectation when I watched it with my girlfriend, anticipating a terrible but entertaining horror movie. Unfortunately, this movie transitions from entertaining cringe to outright boredom, so much so that we couldn't even finish the remainder of the movie. But for the sake of making this video, I had to torture myself by finishing the rest of the movie. And I must admit, the film's nomination for the worst picture of 2023 is very well deserved. I mean, the plot of this movie is very confusing. It starts off with the backstory of Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, but then randomly transitions to a group of friends whose purpose adds no value to the overall plot except perhaps their own deaths. All the characters in the movie, including Christopher Robin, felt intentionally underdeveloped, leading me to care less about what happens to them next. The movie could have benefited if it had focused more on Christopher Robin's connection with Winnie the Pooh instead of adding a group of unnecessary characters that only added extra screen time. Additionally, the acting and dialogue for this movie were so poorly performed by the entire cast, making it difficult to take any of the characters seriously. Another significant issue I had with this movie is that it shares a common problem with the recent Five Nights at Freddy's movie, which I also thought was pretty terrible. Both movies seem to struggle to establish whether they aim to be a truly terrifying horror movie or a cheesy horror comedy, except there's no comedy. If this movie had embraced its potential as a cheesy horror comedy, it could have become a cult classic, especially using such an iconic character, but because the writing was so poor, humor couldn't even make it into this movie. Despite this movie's flaws, the gruesome kills kept me engaged, like the brutal style scene in the cult classic horror series Terrifier. However, due to the messy plot, underwhelming acting, and just feeling very dull, this movie makes for a terrible viewing experience and probably the worst horror movie I've ever seen. I just hope the sequel to Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, doesn't take another L, for the silly old bear's sake. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please watch another one because it lets YouTube know that my videos are worth recommending to more people. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed me yap you to death, and I will see you in the next one.